Well, welcome everyone, both the who are joining us here in the audience in person and those who are joining us on our YouTube channel. My name is Luca Somigli. I am the chair of the Department of Italian Studies and the Goggio professor in Italian Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's lecture by George Elliott Clarke. I will in fact, introduce someone who will properly say a few words of introduction to George Elliott Clarke, my colleague Paolo Frascat. So, Paolo, come on up and I'll yield the floor to you. And thank you, George, for joining us here and for agreeing to give this talk to our in our Goggio Share program.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to see a full room. We have a wonderful speaker I'll be introducing. The biography is long because we have a very important speaker today. So I'm going to read it all, okay? So the fourth Poet Laureate of Toronto from 2012 to 2015 and the seventh Parliamentary / Canadian Poet Laureate 2016-17, George Elliott Clarke hails from Windsor, Nova Scotia. Clarke is a pioneering scholar of African Canadian literature, with two major tomes to his credit: Odyssey's Home, Mapping African Canadian Literature, and Directon's Home, Approaches to African Canadian Literature. A professor of English here at the University of Toronto, Clarke has taught also at Duke, McGill, the University of British Columbia, and Harvard. He holds eight honorary doctorate degrees, as well as a number of appointments to the Order of Nova Scotia, the Order of Canada. He's a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, and has received a number of recognitions, including the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Prize, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, the National Magazine Gold Award for Poetry, as well as international prizes, fellowships from Romania to the US and China. Where am I here? His acclaimed titles include While It Falls, which was translated into Chinese, Beatrice Chancy, translated into Italian, Execution Poems, Blues and Bliss, I and I, Illicit Sonnets, Traverse, Canticles 2 and 3, and J'accuse, Poem versus Silence. Clarke penned the libretto for James Rolfe's triumphant tragic opera, Beatrice Chancy, plus 2 lyrics for the Moments 2022 Polaris Heritage Prize winning album, We're Still Standing. And if this weren't enough, Professor Clarke has also published on Italian Canadian literature, offering very useful comparisons with African Canadian literature that can help Italian Canadians understand their position in the Canadian cultural landscape, as well as their relationship with migration history and with the state itself. This comparative scholarship, which students read in my Italian Canadian Studies course last semester, and some of them are here today, offers valuable and indispensable opportunities for mutual recognition and critique. And in this mutuality, we can learn better who we are in the Canadian context as Italian Canadians. We're so honored to have you with us, George. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining, and please help me welcome Professor George Elliott Clarke.
Hello. Thank you. I do need to say grazie. I suppose I should stand over here. So I say grazie, grazie, grazie again. And as my companion Giovanna knows, when we visit Tropea, everyone is really excited to see me and especially hear me enter into their premises, because I will say buongiorno and so forth, and they forgive me for massacring the proper pronunciation of Italian words and so on. But I also think that they're okay with me doing my best to express myself in a very beautiful language. So on. I also need to say very explicitly, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you, and on this topic of comparing African Canadian and Italian Canadian literary connections, and basically through looking at two very important anthologies. Now, some of you will have already heard or read some of the material that I'll be sharing with you today. But I still encourage you to ask me gentle questions at the conclusion, and I will sit since a chair has been provided, and so on. And I hope everyone can hear and see me well enough. So I begin by, in fact, I should begin this way by explaining exactly how I came to think about the possible connections and the real connections actually between Italian Canadian and Black Canadian or African Canadian literatures and political positions and so on in Canada. And it has to do with being asked by James Roth, a very fine composer, born in Ottawa, Jewish Canadian in background, who was already pretty well known in the early 90s for writing experimental, progressive, and often atonal new music compositions. And he came across some of my poetry in an anthology called Poets 88 from 1988. And he was really attracted to the fact that I tend to be pretty visceral in my poetry. Or at least some people think I'm pretty visceral. He certainly thought so. And he thought it would be a good idea to attempt to write an opera. And so he really wanted to move away from some of the sparer forms of music that he had been exploring and was already pretty celebrated for, to look at gutsier and more rhythmic and more, well, visceral kinds of composition. And he wanted to do it over the full length of a 5-act opera. So he sought me out, and we discussed a few ideas about what could be a good subject for an opera. And I remembered having read the so-called closet drama by Percy Bysshe Shelley called The Cenci, C-E-N-C-I, of course, named for the Roman noble family who were involved in a very tragic series of incidents that involved basically the practical extermination of the entire family back on September 11, 1599. And I won't go into all the details of the Cenci story, except to say that it's just great. It's a great story for anyone who wants to do a kind of Quentin Tarantino film. Lots of blood, lots of sex, lots of greed, lots of gold, lots of purple wine, and so on, and grisly circumstances, and people being shackled and chained and locked up in supposedly impregnable castles upon into which, nevertheless, no matter how impregnable those castles may be, there's always a workman with a ladder who can find his way to intrude through a window and eventually romance and impregnate the daughter of the noble family that owns the castle. And this is what happened in real life for Beatrice Cenci in the later 16th century. She found herself in love with and then impregnated by the guy who handled the horses, whose name was Olympio. Anyway, afraid that her father would find out about her pregnancy, she decided the best thing to do would be to knock him out, bump him off. And so she had her lover Olympio and his poet friend Marzio kill him in his sleep. But that was okay because he was first drugged by his wife. You see, the villain in the piece and the victim of the murder, Francesco Cenci, was hated by everybody. So even when the family lied about having murdered him and said he fell to his death from a balcony overlooking the ravine in Petrella where this murder took place, everybody in the village below, also hating Francesco, said, okay, we can go with that. That's all right. That's a good story. It's a good cover story. We can accept that. And everybody lived happily ever after for 2 years until the church decided they should investigate the rumors that this had actually been a murder, because someone in the family, or the family of the Cenci family, had neglected to pay to the coffers of the church satisfactory sums to make sure that the soul of Francesco Cenci would be well looked after in the afterlife. So The church investigated it. They sent a guy and gave him the right to torture nobles, which is a very strange thing because nobles normally weren't tortured. But in this case, the Cenci surviving members of the family were all tortured, and they all confessed to the murder. And I'm taking too long to get to the point. I told this story to James Rolfe, and he said, "That's it. That's our opera." And I said, "Okay, great. I'm glad you like the story as much as I do. But let's set it in slaveholding Nova Scotia in 1801. Let's make our Beatrice Chansey, and let's make her the mixed race daughter of a slave master father, who, of course, in our story is Francis Chansey. But apart from those differences of setting and slight differences in characterization, the story, our operatic story, basically follows the well-known story of the Cenci clan and catastrophe and tragedy. And just to sum up with that, the surviving members of the family, except for Francesco's youngest son, were all executed in Rome before a mob on September 11, 1599. But to write that opera, I began to read a lot of Italian literature in translation. I began to watch a lot of gialli films, again with the subtitles and so on. And I loved them. And I loved all the 1960s Italian pop, Bring It On. I loved it all. And read everybody I could. Of course, Dante and of course some of the great writers translated into English in the 20th century, and so on. Poets, of course, Pasolini, everybody, the filmmakers. I really studied very, very closely. So when I came across Roman candles, as I was working on African Canadian literature, really trying to establish it as a field, I was struck by the equivalences I saw between what Pier Giorgio Di Cicco was trying to do as editor of Roman Candles and what Harold Hidd, as editor of what he thought was the first African Canadian anthology, which he titled Canada in Us Now, published 1976 rather, excuse me. I was really struck by some of the similarities as well as by the differences between Di Cicco and Hidd and their anthologies. So having set out that background, I'll get into the talk. If this essay is a tapestry, it is one threaded with the flamboyant gilt of mea culpa and caveat lector. Ignorant of the subtle, delicate, and intricate lineaments of Italian-Canadian literature and culture, I am foolhardy in hazarding any opinions about the ways in which the first anthology of Italian-Canadian literature, Roman Candles, an anthology of poems by 17 Italo-Canadian poets, 1978, edited by Pier Giorgio Di Cicco, might be alleged to share affinities with the first widely circulated African-Canadian literary anthology in English, Canada in Us Now, the first anthology of Black poetry and prose in Canada from 1976, edited by Harold Hidd. However, while I cannot define the history, politics, and institutions of Italian-Canadian literature, I may acknowledge its apparent similarities with its African-Canadian counterpart, for their foundational anthologies address equivalent issues. The comparison is neither illicit nor illogical, for despite their contrasting temporal, cultural, and linguistic origins, both of these minority groups fostered Canadian literatures, first achieved critical mass in the 1970s. Moreover, their mutual coming to voice, so to speak, coincided with increased immigration from their homelands and the announcement by the Canadian state on 8th of October 1971 of an official policy to promote the development of multicultural society within a superstructure of official bilingualism. Indeed, in its response to the report of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in 1971, the 28th Parliament of Canada, led by Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, forecasted the basic social environment in which the Hidd and Di Cicco anthologies would appear. Canadian identity will not be undermined by multiculturalism. Indeed, we believe that cultural pluralism is the very essence of Canadian identity. Every ethnic group has the right to preserve and develop its own culture and values within the Canadian context. To say that we have two official languages is not to say we have two official cultures, and no particular culture is more official than another. A policy of multiculturalism must be a policy for all Canadians. And just as a little side note, the only time that Pierre Elliott Trudeau ever mentioned the word or used the word multiculturalism in the House of Commons was when he made this statement, October 8, 1971. He never spoke about it again in Parliament. Two, both Di Cicco and Head and their various contributors had similar social agendas. Number one, to articulate a group identity. Number two, to reject both segregation and assimilation. Number three, to create a dialogue with other ethnic Canadians. Consequently, Di Cicco's Roman Candles and his predecessor, Head's Canada and Us Now, advanced their social-political interests in complementary ways. This accidental near coalition offers an implicit defense of bureaucratized multiculturalism, while also underscoring the unity within diversity of distinct but parallel literary cultures. And I'll just pause to say at this point, and I'll say a little bit about this going forward. But it is important to recognize that one of the consequences of the promulgation of official multiculturalism was the appearance, all of a sudden, of a whole series of ethnically related anthologies of one sort or another, speaking about one particular minority Canadian experience or another, and often, of course, supported by grants from the Multiculturalism Secretariat. It was not yet a department of multiculturalism, which didn't come around or come along until 1988 under Brian Mulroney. So Roman Candles in Canada and Us Now are two of these anthologies, which appear in the wake of the establishment of the federal multiculturalism program. Prompted by concerns for national unity, the program sought to improve Canadian national identity by promoting, said Trudeau, confidence in one's own identity. Out of this can grow respect for others and a willingness to share ideas, attitudes, and assumptions. Trudeau believed that, he says, a vigorous policy of multiculturalism will help create this initial confidence. It can form the basis of a society which is based on fair play for all. Though Trudeau's rhetoric is lackluster and vague, the policy itself is revolutionary. And I know that a lot of people cast a lot of doubt on multiculturalism from both the left and the right, and those critiques from either direction have a lot going for them. There's a lot of accuracy in the critiques of multiculturalism, but the most radical impact of multiculturalism is that it was the first time that the government of Canada recognized other Canadians, Canadians who were not primarily Francophone in derivation or Anglophone in derivation. And so that's what made it particularly radical. And you can see it as following in the footsteps of the promulgation of official bilingualism in 1969, where the federal state, the Canadian federal government, ceased to present itself as being Anglophone, and instead said, "Oh, by the way, we're also Francophone. We will now recognize that Francophones are also citizens of Canada." It only took until 1969, but there it was. And the follow-up to that was, of course, the multiculturalism policy, which begins 1971. And again, both of these policies, a recognition of the bilingual fact of Canada and the multiculturalism fact of Canada, were both the byproducts of the By and By Commission, which started up in 1965 under Prime Minister Pearson, to look at trying to renew Confederation given the pressures of Quebec's Quiet Revolution, which had begun with the election of Premier Lesage in 1960, and which was calling openly for an overhaul of the Federation to perhaps recognize Quebec as being a separate nation within Canada, the whole de nation concept, and which, of course, the federal government, especially with Pierre Trudeau as Minister of Justice, were trying to push back against, and then later as Prime Minister also was trying to push back against and tamp down by arguing instead that, Francophones had a particular role and a particular recognition within the government of Canada, they were not necessarily any more distinct or special than other ethnicities within the Canadian federal state as well. So By 1976 and 1978, then, when the Hid and Di Cicco anthologies appear, song and dance, multicultural festivals and celebrations were commonplace. And you can say that Di Cicco's anthology was, well, you can see that was funded by the Canada Council Arts Funding Agency. But Harold Hid's anthology was published by the Marxism-infused New Canada Press. Neither book received funding from the Multiculturalism Secretariat. Nevertheless, both entered an environment where state multiculturalism was being instrumentalized as an opportunistic means of cementing ethnic allegiances to the governing liberals, while also serving as a propaganda bulwark against the independence-minded government in Quebec. Excuse me. In other words, while eschewing any imbrication with state multiculturalism in the 1970s, both Hid and Di Cicco produced works engaging inevitably with its principal discourses: pro-immigration, pro-Canadian identity, pro-diversity, and pro-national unity or anti-separatism. Such an engagement was inevitable because multiculturalism proposed in the 1970s to forge Canada into a truly global and metropolitan community, the argument of Kinsella, or a multi-ethnic mosaic within which multiple allegiances are fostered, the argument of Stanford. Hid and Di Cicco participate in a discussion then that was heralding what Fo Niemi calls the age of mosaic democracies. However, neither editor could articulate in 1976 or 1978 a truly Catholic multiculturalism, for both were pursuing in occasionally clashing terms culturally ethnic nationalist aesthetics and agendas. In We Have Come, his introduction to Canada and Us Now, Hid, in fealty to the Black liberation ethos then popular among Black intellectuals in urban Canada, voices an ars poetica of Black power. This anthology is representative of the collective consciousness of people in the act of liberating themselves and us from a legacy which denied their humanity and heaped scorn on the culture of colonial peoples. For Hid, who came from South Africa, the writers canvassed in his anthology, he says, reaffirm the spirit of all mankind striving to be free. So he disparages petty work, mandating simply the pretty arrangement of words for the edification of a cultured minority. Hid's dismissal of supposedly dismally bourgeois art dovetails with his publisher's sworn interest in publishing books and pamphlets that will be of assistance to the Canadian people's struggle for national liberation. Now bring that on, please, again. Hid's guiding principles are both Marxist and Pan-Africanist, representing an alliance between Anglo Canadian nationalists anxious about US influence in Canada and Black community activists anxious for greater influence within Canadian society. In his preface, Di Cicco is briefer than Hid and less directly political. His impetus for assembling Roman candles is purely cultural, not socialist. Feeling isolated, he says, from other Italian Canadian writers, as well as self-conscious about his dual culture and heritage, he wants to begin a conversation. Di Cicco offers no palaver of liberation, no gestures towards a collective consciousness. Instead, he organizes a conference of poets who express, oh, thank you, grazie, a bicultural sensibility, Italian and Anglo Canadian. Right. Another difference also separates the two anthologists. Introducing his anthology, Hid centralizes the Black immigrant experience. The politics of dislocation and relocation are his writer's focus. He says, the majority of the contributors to this anthology are new Canadians. Some have been here only 4 years. 2 have lived here for the past 20 years, and 3 are fourth-generation Canadians. Di Cicco applies an opposing emphasis. He says, all the poets included have one sure thing in common. They are not immigrants. They were brought here by their families at an early age, and 3 were born in North America. Hid feels that his mainly immigrant authors seek to realize Black liberation, albeit in concert with Canadian aspirations to achieve a socialist society. Di Cicco classes his authors, in contrast, as practically native North Americans or Canadians. Their usage of English cancels, Di Cicco believes, their putatively alien origins. Opposing Hid, Di Cicco claims a Canadian identity for his contributors. By denying émigré status to children, Di Cicco suggests they are Canadian by birth. Yet the author's bios discredit this assumption. For instance, John Melfi, born in Italy in 1947, arrived in Canada in 1956. Joseph Rinaldo, born in Italy in 1940, landed in Canada in 1952. Filippo Salvatore, born in Italy in 1948, was 16 when his family removed to Canada. The idea of a common North America shared by Italian immigrants enables Di Cicco to count the US-born Mike Zizis as Canadian. So the editor defines strategically his Italo-Canadian writers as Canadian. The contrasting emphases of Hid and Di Cicco are underscored by Di Cicco's seeming riposte to Hid's title, which is, of course, Canada in Us Now, the first anthology of Black poetry and prose in Canada. And so Di Cicco goes on to say in his introduction, I decided to limit the work to that written in English, largely to avoid an anthology, the title of which would be The Italian Poets Writing in Canada. Now, I don't know for sure, I can't say for sure whether Di Cicco ever came across Harold Hid's anthology, but this emphasis or oppositional point that he makes seems to be, again, a kind of rejection of the idea of that his poets should be considered as simply writing in Canada. No, they are Canadian writers, which is exactly a point that Hid is not interested in making at all. Di Cicco wishes to explore what, if anything, these poets could bring to Anglo-Canadian poetry, to accent their fortunate and tragic position of having to live with two cultures, one more exterior than the other. Di Cicco's Italo-Canadian poets interest him for the ways in which they manifest Italianness within the dominant discourse of English or specifically Anglo-Canadian literature. For his part, Hid ignores Canadian literature. He's got no interest in it whatsoever. The potential existence and availability of a dual Black and Canadian sensibility is irrelevant. His desire is to unify Blacks, those who happen to be in Canada, not to promote integration with Canadians who are thought of as white. Yes, Hid recognizes that his contributors share with Anglo-Canadians a British heritage. They were, he says, schooled in Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Blake, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and Browning, and are from Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, St. Vincent, South Africa, Nigeria, and Canada, all former British colonies. Still, Hid's poets and prose writers hail from fundamentally the Black world, and their compositions return in spirit to origins to Africa, where the work of the artist is even today at one with his community. So just to say it just plainly and directly, Hid is not interested in adding anything in terms of his poets, and he includes 3 fiction writers, to Canadian literature. It's not clear he's ever heard of Margaret Atwood, and nor does he want to, and he's not interested in Pierre Burton. He just is not. He's interested in bringing together Black poets and Black writers in Canada who are, in his mind, could contribute to a reunification in a Pan-African discourse around the world, but basically based in Canada or coming from Canada because these writers happen to be in Canada. And I should make the point here that prepositions are important. We often don't recognize them as being important, but they are. The fact that Hid is talking about Black writers who happen to be in Canada, but not of Canada, is very important, because that is his emphasis. And those, as I'll mention later on, those who are in fact of Canada, he doesn't really appreciate very much at all. He sees them as being basically failed Black people. But anyway, to go on, while Di Cicco seeks to identify the Italo-Canadian displaced sensibility or bicultural sensibility, and its contribution realized her potential to English Canadian poetry, Hid is obsessed strikingly with how his authors replicate Africa in their subjects and rhetoric, for they belong to the third world, a purportedly primary allegiance. Hid's writers are, he urges, building a Pan-Africanist, not a Canadian literature. He sees then only the possibility of a Black and Canadian, which for him means white workers, liberation movement uniting to oppose American and European imperialist capitalism. There are blacks and there are Canadians, and there's no hyphen necessary because that will just confuse everybody. The only hyphenated Canadians Hid discusses are the so-called Afro-Canadian or multi-generational African-Canadian writers. And for him, these are flawed people because he actually says that they carry the stigma of, quote, historical and psychological castration. Thanks a lot, Harold, for that diagnosis. In his anthology preface, Hid craves a unified Black collectivity within Canada, whose writings participate in a global Pan-African Black empowerment movement, but whose politics leave room for opportune leftist alliances with white Canadians. Of course, Di Cicco has an entirely different agenda, which is basically to argue for a space within Canadian literature, Anglo-Canadian literature, for Italian-Canadian poets. And what he's trying to contest is not so much white supremacist racism, of course, is not an interest of his to contest that. What he wants to contest is Canadian nationalism, Anglo-Canadian nationalism, which is focusing, from his perspective, too much on Canadians of British descent, British heritage, and on the other hand, only wanting to incorporate minority ethnic voices so long as they will also shore up the promulgation of an Anglo-centric Canadian nationalism vis-a-vis American imperialism, cultural imperialism, especially. So he wants to make, Di Cicco wants to make, or he prefers rather, writers who will remake English and French Canadian literature and culture in a new Italian Canadian image. Despite their tactical challenges to a Canadian culture dominated by whites, according to Hid, and Anglo, says Di Cicco, the editors differ on strategy. Hid considers blacks who happen to live in Canada. Di Cicco is concerned with Italian Canadians who feel stranded between an Italy where they are not remembered and a Canada that superimposes an Anglo or Franco culture upon them. Hid views Canada implicitly as a white country that is a nearly irrelevant host for a Black/African population, which he sees as being in provisional exile. For Di Cicco, the Italian immigrant quarrel with English and French Canada is a battle among Europeans in exile, with Italians protesting the tendency of Anglo-Saxons and Gauls to hog Canada for themselves. In other words, Hid constructs from Black Canada a Pan-African Union established within the blank waste space of semi-colonial Canada. Di Cicco seeks, in contrast, a concordat with English-Canadian culture and literature. Despite their clashing philosophical anthems, Hid and Di Cicco compose anthologies that harmonize remarkably. And so I want to begin to talk about exactly what they seem to share in common. Di Cicco selects writers from Italy, Canada, and the United States. And so his approach also approximates multiculturalism, for the writers from these three locales matured in vastly different societies. For his part, Hid imports the Black world to Canada. Di Cicco introduces Canadians to a multifarious Italian identity and experience. So he closes his preface with the poem My Genealogy by John Robert Colombo that speaks to a family lineage of incessant cultural fusion and transfusion. Its last four stanzas merit recitation here. So stanza 9, blood flows through my veins at different speeds. Italian, German, Greek, French Canadian, sometimes it mixes. 10, at times I feel close to the Aegean, the Côte d'Azur, the Lombard Plain, and the Black Forest. 11, I seldom feel close to the Rocky Mountains, the prairies, the Great Lakes, or the cold St. Lawrence. And then he writes in italics, what am I doing in Toronto? 12, if this means being Canadian, I am a Canadian. Di Cicco sounds Colombo so as to flesh out his own precept that the true Canadian citizen remains a foreigner if only to remain a citizen of the world. Now, strangely, Hid supports a similar internationalism. His Caribbean-born contributors are, he feels, a new adjunct, he says, to the Black and Canadian communities, and that all Blacks offer other Canadians a unique opportunity, a window, and a tangible link with the Third World. Hid urges to recast Di Cicco that the true Black Canadian remains a foreigner, if only to remain a citizen of the larger Black world. And one can think of Afrocentrism and Pan-Africanism as contemporary impulses of that sort, even amongst African Canadians, as variegated as we are. The poem that articulates Hid's aims in Canada in Us Now is Liz Cromwell's We Have Come, whose title also Hid's introduction. Here is its opening stanza. To Toronto we have come as men, seeking shapes in a long-lost dream across the green seas. We who dried our blackness in the sun have come as bondsmen without shame or home, to seek a loaf of fame, redeem our pride, imbibe the juice of pain, to do what we as creatures of past dreams of smoke have made us. These bondsmen of Cromwell and Hid face a major peril, forgetting their original Caribbean heritages and thus becoming, as she says, whitewashed Negroes of the much touted sad mosaic of multiculturalism. To avoid this danger, Hid's anthology seeks to reconstitute a coherent Black community within the forbidding white vastness of Canada. Similarly, Di Cicco wishes to save Italo-Canadians from the isolationism created by Anglo Canadian nationalism, as well as from the convenience of a melting pot or assimilation. So he engineers his anthology. Italian Canadian scholar Joseph Pivato applauds such cultural work. As he writes, the publication of ethnic anthologies creates an identity for the group or generation, stimulates reader interest in the writers as a group, encourages the writers to publish their own work, begins to create critical and academic interest in the writers. Pier Giorgio Di Cicco's 1978 anthology of Italian Canadian poets, Roman Candles, did all of these things and more. So to revise Hid, then, Di Cicco denies a future of utterly Gallicized or Saxonized Italians. Explicitly, both Hid and Di Cicco defend the maintenance of distinctive cultural heritages in an officially multicultural society. By pursuing a definite policy of hyphenated Canadianism, a concept supported by his use of the term Italo-Canadian, Di Cicco rejects the rightist liberal view that the hyphenated concept can undermine Canadian identity. By showcasing poets who voice a bicultural sensibility, Di Cicco flouts critics such as US liberal Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who deems multiculturalism dangerously divisive. It encourages government to segregate citizens along racial, ethnic, and linguistic fault lines. Di Cicco's practice also counters, however, the vision of Japanese Canadian cultural activist R.L. Gabriele Nishiguchi, who alleges the hyphen is, quote, that tiny splash of ink uniting words, but distancing worlds. By compiling Roman Candles, Di Cicco offers an eloquent retort to those who, in the name of advancing Canadian or Quebecois unity, request the erasure of minority cultural specificity. Although Hid is disappointed by the only hyphenated Canadian group he discusses, that is to say, those of us who are psychologically castrated, that's not to say that he's against multiculturalism. His chief passion is the unification here of intellectual Black and third world emigres and exiles. His totalizing Black vision nixes any hyphen. The rhetoric of Black consciousness and anti-imperialism is the rallying point for Black and brown Asian intellectuals displaced into Canada. From this perspective, Canada in Us Now is an inversion of the more natural title, Us in Canada Now. His interest is not Canadian citizenship, but the raising of a phalanx of African heritage intellectuals to continue to agitate from a Canadian vantage point for anti-racism in Canada and anti-apartheid and anti-colonialism abroad. Di Cicco accents the bicultural Italo-Canadian identity of his writers, but his anthology affirms multiculturalism by appearing in English. Moreover, he also includes poets who demonstrate the apparent influence of Jewish Canadian writers on for at least three of the Roman Candle poets. And that's yet another glimpse of multiculturalism at work or play. I know that time is getting on, so I'm going to jump ahead here and just point out that Canada in Us Now shows no interest in any Canada-located minority group except for African heritage people. Instead, Hid's writers display a multicultural vision by limning a Pan-African and Third World-oriented Blackness. The anthology describes, and prescribes a polyphonous, international, and kaleidoscopic Blackness, the very form of African Canadianité. And so the poet Vibert Cambridge anatomizes contemporary West Indian immigration as a further globalization of the African diaspora. Now that there are Black people in Canada, at least from this very presentist point of view, as of 1976, we can now say that Canada has a role to play in the Pan-African diaspora or international Black liberation movements. And of course, that kind of sentiment is ahistorical because it overlooks the Black communities historically present in Canada, Nova Scotia, in Ontario, and Essex County, even on the prairies in places like Amber Valley and Edmonton, and in New Brunswick, that have been here for a century or more, or even 2 centuries, who had been often engaged in gestures towards international Black liberation. Of course, abolitionism, abolishing slavery. But for a poet like Vibert Cambridge, there simply is no knowledge of that history. So he wants to pretend that only with the arrival of the Black newcomers of the 1960s can we actually talk about Canada being part of the African diaspora. And I may be belaboring this point too much, but I do want to remind Vibert Cambridge, if he could hear me remind him, that the movements of the Black loyalists into Nova Scotia, Black refugees from the War of 1812 to Nova Scotia, the Maroons of Jamaica to Nova Scotia, 1796. Not to mention the Underground Railroad fugitives coming into Ontario and Quebec between 1831 and 1861 in the tens of thousands, all represented movements, of course, against enslavement and calling for the end of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the practice of slavery within the Americas, so-called Americas. But at the same time, that is true, these are also movements that were international, completely international. So I know I'm taking too much time to critique Vibert Cambridge's very innocent claim of arrival and of arrival as being the inauguration of something, when in fact these political movements have been underway for a very long time. Reflecting his anthology's thematic bicultural sensibility, Roman Candle's contributors discuss Canada-located crises that debut in the loss of language or culture, and which climax with the death of an elder. And just to give an example, one of those poems that deals with this subject, Antonino Mazza, in his poem Canadese, commands other Italian Canadians to remember their heritage. Don't try to reject your mother tongue. In our cage, it is wrong. Do canaries smother their private song? His poem Death in Italy recounts the macabre surrealism of mourning in Canada the death of a father overseas. Ah, not to have seen one's father die. Mute days followed, heart sunk, we stayed at home in one grave lit room. My mother's dress turned black, the men wore death for ties. Black armbands and other sorrow signs, and bands of friends appeared to pay their last respects in absentia. They are ghostly people with ghastly voices when they relate their own death in Italy stories. The pain of separation from parents and relatives abandoned to the old country is a common thematic in Roman Candles. I will jump ahead again. Di Cicco's poets straddle Italy and Canada, or at least they attempt to bridge both countries. But his poets still seek a homeland that is fully their own, a Canada that is welcoming, or a Caribbean that is truly free from neo-colonial control. Vibert Cambridge states, we have until tomorrow to make our countries, and ask, when will we stop making our countries their countries? and still have no country to call our own. No Black person, whether born in Canada or not, can evade the historical mission of revolt, which Hid himself insists upon. So again, emphasizing that the first perspective, the first patriotism, so to speak, that his assembled Black poets and writers need to respect is the affinity to Pan-Africanism, to African liberation, to international Black movement, and really not to have much of an alliance with Canadians, except in terms of trying to establish a socialist Canada. And I am coming to the conclusion. Introducing the anthology of Italian Canadian writing, editor Joseph Pivato recognizes that prior to the arrival of Di Cicco's anthology, there were many Italian writers and many books by Italians living in Canada, but they did not constitute a conscious literature. Instead, their writing represented, he says, individual works produced by isolated writers who did not see themselves as creators of a new literature, but as Italian writers in exile or travelers, or as writers in Canada who adopted the new language. Hid's 1976 anthology features a similar psychology. The us in Canada now are not yet African Canadian, nor is their writing consciously that of Black Canadians, but rather it is representative of Black poetry and prose in Canada, as the subtitle says, or as the dedication puts it, the anthology presents the collective consciousness of the African diaspora in Canada today. Nevertheless, Hid, like Di Cicco for Italian Canadian writing, helps to usher in a self-aware African Canadian literature by consciously grouping together writers of disparate cultural and national origins. While neither Hid nor Di Cicco engages with official multiculturalism, their respective groupings of Blacks in Canada and Italo-Canadians could make sense only in the context of a society dominated racially by whites and culturally by Anglos and Francos. In sum, their respective writer collages, Pan-African, Canadian, and transatlantic Mediterranean Canadian, conjured up an intra-communal multiculturalism that made official multiculturalism less stable, that is to say, more dynamic, whatever its status quo proclivities. And I will pause and welcome any gentle questions that may be offered. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have time for questions. If anyone has, please raise your hand. I can begin with a question. I've always struck anytime I pick up the book Roman Candles. It begins with the first set of poems is 3 poems to Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, right? There's already this very strong colonial orientation. A citation from one of those poems dedicated to John Cabot is also on the 4th cover. And so I wanted to push a little bit further in that direction. Is this also a statement of Italians being what historians have called assistant Canadians with respect to the colonization of Canada, with John Cabot being, not necessarily, we don't actually know a lot about where he landed and so on and so forth, perhaps Cape Bonavista in the Maritimes. But what happens in African Canadian literature with respect to the relationship with Indigenous peoples, or trying to sort of use history as therapy to justify one's presence in this new land? Because I don't think this very colonial orientation will be present in that literature, but I'm curious to know if this relationship is articulated in any way.
Oh, wow. That is such a terrifically difficult question. And so comprehensive, Paolo. Oh, my golly. Where to begin? Well, I'll begin with Di Cicco's introduction and again, his nervousness and anxiety about where to place Italian writers displaced, in a sense, displaced from Italy, having arrived in Canada, landed in Canada, but not being accepted as part, not really being accepted as part of Canadian culture, whether it's Anglo or Franco, but being marginalized outside of it. And even in terms of going into the history of the Second World War, the internment of Italian Canadians in New Brunswick and around outside Fredericton, Gagetown, and also in Petawawa, Ontario. So the actual enmity of the Canadian state during the Second World War against Italians, Italian Canadians to be really precise, and that kind of brutality and marginalization, which was also practiced, of course, against Japanese Canadians on the West Coast, but not, interestingly enough, and I'm not saying it should have been practiced against German Canadians, but it was not. And so I'm still beginning to answer the great question here. I think that it's arguable, and you'll know a lot more about this than myself, that Italian Canadian intellectuals and writers feeling that deliberate marginalization and separation from other white Europeans in command of the Canadian state, again, Anglo and Franco, developed the theory that the best way to find their own ways towards the center of power would be to develop exactly what Di Cicco suggests, a bicultural sensibility, either Italo-Anglo or Italo-Franco, and in some cases, such as with the great intellectual Antonio D'Alfonso, all three at one time. But to get to the point, that would require reminding Francophone and Anglophone Canadians of the Italian cultural contribution and political contribution, and even, in a sense, military contribution in terms of, if you think of the settlement of North America as being a series of invasions and conquests, led by the very first Italian explorer, discoverer, Christoph Colombo, then you need to find a way to write Italians into that narrative of discovery, and I shouldn't say write them into that narrative, but rather centralize them in that narrative, so that they may also take their place eventually in terms of the blended ruling class, European Canadian ruling class of Canada. And I'm supported in making this or putting forward this idea because of that great work of 1965, John Porter's Vertical Mosaic, right? And which is very clear of pointing out the ethnic mosaic makeup of Canada, but more importantly, the class hierarchy that is made up of that mosaic. And he's also very clear in 1965 about the position of Italians as a class within the ethnic hierarchy that is represented by the vertical mosaic, which essentially, of course, is to be the toilers, the builders, construction workers, and so on, which was at that point in Canadian history their given place within the Canadian economic infrastructure. So for intellectuals coming from that community, it was very important to push back against that marginalization and economic ghettoization by rewriting the histories of Canada from opposing that English and French direction or directedness of that history to again centralize the figures of Giovanni Caboto, of course, Cristoforo Colombo, and others, to make the point that the colonization of Canada also involved it also involved Italians as persons who were central to that movement of Europeans into the Americas. But to switch to, I'm still going to continue with talking about the Italian Canadian situation for a moment, because that anxiety about at what point can Italian Canadians actually talk about having a position in the ruling class, which has generally been essentially Anglo and Franco, when could that possibly be achieved? And if you look back to the Paul Martin government of 2003 to 2006, December 2003 to 2006, one of the flashpoints of controversy for that government was the idea that some had that there were either too many Italian Canadians in the cabinet. Some of you might remember this, that there was some discussion of whether or not there were maybe too many Italian Canadians in the cabinet of Paul Martin or not enough. That there was a particular stress around that for that government. And so I see that as being one more position as late as 2003 to 2006 of a kind of statement of anxiety of the place of Italian Canadians within, again, the Canadian ruling class. But the switch over now to African Canadians, Black Canadians, there are of course a whole set of differences that have to be taken into account. And the first one is the fact that our ancestors did not arrive as settlers or as immigrants, of course, but rather as enslaved people and as people who were commanded to have to be here. If they were in fact enslaved by New France in what is now Quebec or what is now Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, or whether they were brought in by Yankees in 1760 to Nova Scotia, in particular Yankees arriving from New England as well as from Dixie, bringing enslaved African Americans with them. In both groups, both the French and the English, we can talk about them bringing enslaved Black people to Nova Scotia in the hundreds in the mid-18th century. So that community, or our community, begins with enslaved people, and not just in Nova Scotia, but in what are now Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, these 5 eastern provinces of Canada. And then we have the incoming anti-slavery abolitionists, refugees, and fugitives arriving as of 1783 in the thousands. So you've got the Black Loyalists, 1783, 3,500 people. You've got the Black refugees from the War of 1812, 2,000 people. You've got the Maroons, I can't leave them out, 1796, 600 people, all going into Nova Scotia. Many of them leave and end up going to Africa, to Sierra Leone. But for those who stay in Nova Scotia, as well as this is also true for the Underground Railroad Blacks who ended up in Ontario in the mid-19th century, if they stay, they end up becoming, of course, the lumpen proletariat, underclass, deeply suppressed, oppressed, repressed underclass in Nova Scotia and major cities here in Ontario and Montreal, of course, as well as in rural areas in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and even Salt Spring Island in BC and Vancouver and Victoria. Although those settlers in Vancouver and Vancouver Island were basically well-to-do Californian Blacks who came in, about 800 people in 1848 to British Columbia. And then you fast forward to the age of immigration, post-1955, with the West Indian Development Scheme, which was racist, sexist, and classist, a perfect Canadian trifecta. Because that's how we like to do stuff. And, we're going to do racism and sexism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and everything. We come up with the most brilliant bureaucratic ways to do it. And so the impact of that policy from 1955 was to say that Black men could come from the Caribbean to Canada, but only as students. Only as students. Black women could come to Canada from the Caribbean, but only as maids. Only as maids. It didn't matter how much education they had. You could be a university graduate, but you could only come to Canada under the West Indian Domestic Scheme as a domestic. No matter how many degrees you had, no matter how many private schools you had attended. On the other hand, for Black men, you could only come to Canada as a university student, which meant that you had to be coming to Canada from the middle class, because these are the only people who could have attended the private schools and gone through high school and gone to universities. Not even necessarily a private school or a tremendous high school like the Combermere School for Boys in Barbados, but perhaps even to places like Oxford or Cambridge and so on, given the orientation of the upper classes of the Caribbean towards British higher education. So by the government of Canada saying to these Black immigrants, would-be immigrants to Canada, or and basically not even immigrants yet, but simply students coming to study, they were saying, you send us your best and brightest. We only want middle class and upper middle class Black people from the Caribbean, Black men from the Caribbean to come to Canada. So that first generation of Caribbean immigrants to Canada included people like Austin Clarke, great Black Canadian writer who arrived in Canada in 1955 to study at Trinity College, which was 1955 was the very year that the West Indian domestic scheme started. So I'm going to fast forward here, still answering your great question, that for the incoming middle class and upper middle class Black bourgeoisie from the Caribbean, when they arrive, they are also citizens of the empire. They're also citizens of the Commonwealth. They arrive in Canada, which is nominally independent as of 1931, nominally independent, but still very much tied to Britain psychologically and culturally and so on. So for upper class West Indians coming to Canada from the West Indies, they did not see themselves as being racially inferior. They had not been taught to think of themselves as being racially inferior. They sometimes could see themselves as being superior to white Canadians, to white British Canadians, or white Francophone Canadians for that matter, because they were citizens of the empire. And Canada was only yet another, more or less, colony of Britain. So they arrive in Canada with a sense of, if not noblesse oblige, then definitely equality, that they're already equal. And when they begin to suffer or endure anti-Black racism, their response to it is to say there's something wrong with these people. Don't they understand that we are superior to them? Don't they understand that we have a better education than them? And they would be right, because when you look at the literacy rates in the Caribbean, they're 95%, they're 98%. Folks are extremely well educated. And so I'm still answering your great question, but it was a huge question. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that for Black writers coming into Canada, they would never have looked at Canadian literature as something they wanted to be part of. Unlike Italian Canadians who were trying to find their place within the ruling class and trying to find their place within the intelligentsia, so tightly controlled by the WASP elite in English Canada and by the Francophone elite, of course, in Quebec. So they were looking for a way in. And when you look at someone like Harold Hidd, he's not interested in being in Canadian literature. He's not happy to be in Canada, for crying out loud. He wants to be part of an international Black revolution. For the Black elite coming not only from the Caribbean, but from Africa, coming into Canada. And the only reason they would be allowed to come to Canada would be because they either had already a high degree of education, were already upper middle class or upper class, the sons of prime ministers, the sons of presidents, and so on. Petty bourgeois folks owning businesses and pharmacists and lawyers and so on, and doctors coming into Canada would not have arrived with the sense that they needed to be included in something called Canadian literature. They had their own literature. They would, in fact, at the moment that the Caribbean Blacks are coming into Canada and South Asians are coming into Canada, Toronto, Montreal, to be really precise, and some go to Halifax, some go to Vancouver. But at the same time, that same generation are sending intellectuals to London. They're sending intellectuals to New York. They're sending intellectuals to Paris if they're coming from Haiti. That's where they're going. Some of them come to Toronto. Some of them go to London. And in both cases, they don't see themselves as arriving as second-class people. They may be treated as second class, they may be treated as third class, but they do not see themselves that way. They see themselves as first class. So therefore, their literature is an international Black literature that includes people like James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston a little bit later, and Derek Walcott and Sam Selvin and a whole host of writers from the Caribbean and from Africa. Chinua Achebe comes to mind instantly. And these would also be writers viewed as involved in decolonization. That's a very important point to bring up, because the writers that the incoming Black intelligentsia from the Caribbean and Africa would have been interested in would have been those writers who were documenting decolonization and the struggle against imperialism, right? So for them, they're not concerned about Canadians, English Canadians upset about American imperialism. No, they want to speak back to the British imperialism that colonized them and which had in fact colonized Canada. So when English Canadians are saying to them, join with us, we've got to fight off a bad, rotten, horrible American imperialism. They could agree with that to the extent of wanting to express solidarity with Black Americans in their struggle for their liberation and greater integration within American society. On the other hand, for them, British imperialism was more the recent enemy, and of course, for those coming from Haiti or Guadeloupe, Martinique, then it would be French imperialism. They would not be looking to Margaret Atwood to describe a condition in which they might find themselves in Canada. They would be reading Frantz Fanon. That's who they would be reading. They would be reading Frantz Fanon. They would be reading Malcolm X. They would listen to Malcolm X. They would see themselves not as trying to win entree into Canada. And many of them would have felt that I'm here to get my education, I'm here to establish myself, and then I'm going to go back to Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad and be part of the ruling class in my homeland and direct my homeland into a direction that would be more Pan-Africanist, internationalist, socialist, and in favor of ending apartheid in South Africa, in Southern Africa in general, and breaking away from the connection to Britain and getting rid of the monarchy. These would be the interests of that first generation. So, in other words, I know I've taken a very long time to answer this too comprehensive question, too multifaceted, and so on. But for the Black Canadian writing group in the 1970s, keeping in mind that very few of them would have been from the historical Black community at that point. Most of them would have been immigrants, newcomers to Canada. And I think Hid's introduction says it really clearly, their interest is in unifying Black people for an international cause. And if by chance white Canadian workers want to come along and say, okay, we're socialists, so we want to support that agenda, that's okay. But that's not his interest is not helping Black people to become part of the Canadian ruling class. It's entirely the opposite. So, and I'm still answering the question. So when it comes to the matter of history, there are two competing impulses that show up for Black writers. One of those impulses, which is actually indicated in Hid's anthology, one of those impulses is to highlight the Black presence in Canadian history. So then you begin to have books that come out around the same time as Canada in Us Now, such as a book titled The Black Tile in the Canadian Mosaic. The Black Tile, T-I-L-E, in the Canadian Mosaic. And the point of that book, which was published in 1975, it was a history, was to centralize Black Canadian history. It was one of the first texts to come along, written by an immigrant Black, to not argue for a place for Black people within the Canadian state, but rather to make the point that Canadians had always been in Canada. In fact, The anxiety around that book is to push back against the idea that Black people do not belong in Canada. That was the real impulse behind that book, in my opinion, was to say that Black people can say that they belong to Canada or should be in Canada because we've always been here. And so that history does a fantastic job of centralizing early Black Canadians and so on, not to celebrate a colonization movement within Canada of Black people, like, oh, let's celebrate the Black settlers in Canada. No, and particularly not to celebrate them as a way of getting acceptance by the Canadian state, but rather to remind everyone that Black people do have a place in Canada, can have a place in Canada, because we always have been in Canada. That is one of the impulses. But there was another impulse, which was to argue for a more of a central place for Black Canadians to be considered part of Canadian history. Although that impulse was always tempered by the reality of recognizing that we were not part of the oppressive, or our ancestors, be precise, were not part of the oppressive movements against Indigenous peoples in colonial Canada. And the reason why we can say that with some authority is the fact that Indigenous people and Black people were enslaved together in Nouvelle-France, what is now Quebec. And in fact, the greatest number of slaves in Nouvelle-France were Pawnee people, Indigenous people. Black people were second. There were 3,000 Indigenous slaves in Quebec, 2,000 Black slaves in Quebec. When you come to Nova Scotia, which is where you have the next largest and perhaps the largest association between, the largest and longest association between Black people and Indigenous people, that came about because of the fact that the white settler establishment were intent on forcing Black people to either leave Nova Scotia or to remain a lumpen proletariat if they stayed in Nova Scotia, and of course be subject to freezing, starving to death, and of course persecution by police if they chose to stay there, if they did not leave. On the other hand, those communities, the Black communities in Nova Scotia, segregated and set up on an apartheid basis, were often right next door to Mi'kmaq Indigenous reserves. And so there was a lot of blending, a lot of intermarrying, a lot of just people shacking up together and having babies. I don't mind saying it because that's what they did. And I don't need to have somebody coming along with black robes to say, oh, now you are now officially sanctioned as a couple. People became couples. They wanted to become couples, regardless of whatever kind of sanction there might have been for that, or not for that. And as a result, you get thousands of Afro-Métis people, as I like to call ourselves, resulting from those unions, which also meant that given the relative equality between Black communities and Mi'kmaq reserves, there was much less of that effort to try to say, oh yeah, we have a glorious role to play in the colonization of Nova Scotia or of Canada, simply because we couldn't make those claims because we weren't colonists. The other point that has to be made here is the fact that the Black original colonial Blacks were often involved in the #1 industry in colonial Canada, which was the fur trade, which meant that they were brought into proximity and some degree of alliance with Indigenous peoples who could be helpful for those who were fleeing slavery. At the same time, some Indigenous people did enslave African people at times. And on the other hand, Black people could be helpful to Indigenous people who were being persecuted by white settlers as well. So I'm coming to the end of answering the question, which is this. To wrap it all up in a nutshell, Italian Canadian intellectuals feeling their alienation and marginalization from the power nexus of Gallic and Anglo Canada tried to find ways to write the history W-R-I-T-E, but also R-I-G-H-T, and the cultural landscape, so they could have a place within it without having to become assimilated, without having to give up all of their Italian culture and heritage and language. I believe that was their impulse for their engagement with the Canadian state and cultural institutions. On the other hand, Black Canadians fall into two different groups, although there might be now a little more harmonization between them. For those who were newcomers, especially in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, and so on, there was much less anxiety about wanting to have a place within the Canadian state because they saw, or within Canadian culture, because they saw themselves first as being part of an international Black culture that was Caribbean based. They didn't need to be read in Fredericton because they could be read in Kingston, Jamaica. They could be read in London, England, as an extension of an international Black writing landscape. They could be read in New York by the Bayesian immigrants who ended up in New York in the 19th. Or if they're Haitian, they can be read in Montreal. They can be read in Paris. They can be read in Port-au-Prince. So they don't need to be worried about somebody in Ottawa reading me. It was not necessarily a concern. Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually, you're all invited downstairs in the department. We have some food waiting for us. But thank you. Do we have time for another question, Luca?
Well, we are a bit tight with time.
Yeah, I think we have to leave the room.
But,
the conversation can continue
you can
downstairs.
ask the question while eating, bit of cheese or
Right.
wine. I can promise that.
Thank you so much once again.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you. Whoa.
Thank you for joining us.